All right, thank you very much, Stella, for the introduction. So in this hour now, we're going to talk about bias and transparency of web search engines. So you have already introduced ourselves. Just wanted to briefly say a few words as well. So as Stella said, my name is Frank Hopfgartner, and I work as Senior Lecturer in Data Science. I've been working on personalized search and recommender systems over the last 10, 15 years now. And I'm going to give you a more technical perspective on the subject matter today. And with me here as well is my colleague Joe Bates, who hopefully has a working microphone as well.
Yeah, just about, I think. Yeah, hi everybody. Yes, I'm Joe Bates. I'm a senior lecturer in information politics. As Stella said, most of my research focuses on circulation of data between different actors and the social material factors sort of influencing that. But I have done a bit of work with Jana and some others around bias in web search results, which is something I'm going to be talking about later in this this presentation. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So just to get you, or just to warm you up for this topic, I would like to start with a few questions. Well, first of all, about web search engines. We all know web search engines, and that's probably the most common appearance that we are all used to when we think about web search engines. So it's a question for you, and please type in your answer into the chat window. So how often have you used a web search engine today? Okay, so it's quite a lot. Jana, maybe 50 times. Impressive. Yeah, too many to count. Yes. You see a kind of a tendency, right, that we already use search engines a lot. Okay, so here's the next question for you. And again, just type in your answer in here. So which web search engine have you used or did you use? Okay, Google, DuckDuckGo, Google, Okay, so Jana, I hope that's ironic. So it's another engine other than Google. Okay, so as you see from the results here, it's all about Google apparently. And I'm not surprised, to be honest, to see this, because if you look at some stats and you see this figure that we have here, this is from Statista. You can see the URL here from where I just took a screenshot. This is the worldwide desktop market share of leading search engines over the last 10 years. And you see that the blue line over here, so this one here is Google. It's like in the kind of 80s or 90% of people use Google as their main web search engine. So this is quite interesting, especially considering if you look at what is written on the right side here. In fact, nearly 93% of all web traffic comes through search engines. Yeah, so that means that 93% of all visits to web search engines are started by search engine. On top of this, we can see that Google processes right now 2 trillion searches per year. So what that all means is actually that we rely a lot on web search engines, maybe much more than we suppose than it's healthy for us. I found this paper here by Noel Carroll, wrote in 2014, at the nice title, "In Search We Trust: Exploring How Search Engines Are Shaping Society." And there are two quotes here that I find quite interesting, and I find a good motivation for our lecture today on why we should look into trust and bias of search engines. So Noel said that search has assumed a position of central importance in the way that people access and use online information and service every day. Now just reflect a bit on this, what you're doing, what you just told me here. You use it like countless times and you rely on one company. The next quote is, "By shaping what people know and how people know it, search engines and the organizations are able to wield an immense amount of social power." So that means, well, we kind of see the world through the lens of Google because we rely so much on it. And what that gives a lot of power to Google on kind of wielding our worldview. All right, so this was just kind of to warm you. So let's look at the objectives of our lecture today. So first, the aim is to introduce you to the notion of bias and transparency of web search engines. And by the end of the lecture, in about 1 hour's time, you should hopefully be able to understand the basic operations of web search engines. It's just going to be very brief, just to give you a kind of summary of how these things work. Then hopefully you will be able to identify example cases of information bias in search engines, recognize different methods for analyzing this bias, and also describe how various stakeholders address information bias. All right, here's the outline of our lecture. So the introduction I just covered already now, was what we just talked about. Then I'm going to talk about search engine basics. Then I hand over to Joe, who will talk about different types of bias. Then we look into dealing with bias, and finally provide you some references for further reading. All right, let's start with the search engine basics. So just to give you an example of how we use a search engine, also to introduce a few terminologies already. So let's assume you would be experiencing a pandemic, and you would, of course, like to survive this pandemic. So you would like to, you have an information need, what as we call it in the kind of IR search engine language. Like, how do I protect myself against COVID-19? Yeah, so this is an information need. So what you would do, you would think, oh, okay, I need a protective equipment. So there's a kind of a verbalization of this information need that you have. The next step would then be you would formulate it or code it into a search query. Yeah, so usually we have very short search queries when you use your keyboard. Yeah, we search for example PPE equipment. Yeah, PPE stands for personal protective equipment. So okay, now you have this coding here, and you send this to a search engine. The search engine is then doing something that's called information retrieval. Yeah, so it is actually trying to find relevant documents to your search query. Yeah, and it gives you a ranked list of results. That so imagine all of these results that you have in here. They are web pages about face mask, about rubber gloves, face visors, and so on. Yeah, you will get plenty of. So what you then do, you process this by looking at these, browsing a little bit, and then you decide, oh yeah, okay, I should purchase face masks. So a loop actually, yeah. So usually you don't stop just by clicking at the first result. So you could actually change your information need or notice that you have to update your information need because of the new information that you have just received. Yeah? So you can imagine that. But this is basically maybe a typical search process that you have done today countless times. So, of course, if you look into literature, academic work on this, you will see that there have been various theories and frameworks that have been developed to describe the search process. What I'm not going to go into detail here now because I mean there's not much time for this, but basically what we can say is that these search theories or frameworks, they usually consist of browsing, searching, and navigating. Browsing would be just casual undirected exploration of information structure. They are clicking on links. Querying would be what we just talked about, typing a search query into a search engine, look at the results, and navigating would then be following chains of links. So it's a typical search process. Let's look how a search engine actually works. So what a search engine does first, it deals with data in the web, and it crawls this data and creates an index. Now imagine we have a user who has an information need and codes this into a search query. This search query is then sent to the search engine. Press enter, and then what the search engine does, it tries to match the query with what can be found in the index, and then based on this identifies relevant documents that has been indexed from the web and creates a ranking. The user then gets these rankings presented as the search results, and the user looks at these search results and then hopefully is happy, or again, remember this can be a loop, repeats the whole process. Yeah, so this is how a search engine from a technical perspective works. So what is important to know, though, is that search engines on their own, they never stand on their own. Search engines or information retrieval, which is the process of searching for information on the web or elsewhere, is only the top of the iceberg. So what is equally as important is, well, first of all, for information retrieval, see here, this part is the technical part. So this deals with the representation, storage of, and access to information items. But how this is influenced by humans, yeah, so humans' information behaviors, information seeking. So that means you and I, if we search for something, we all have kind of different prior knowledge, different expectations, which has an impact on how we use the search engine. A further impact is the so-called work task. So it's the kind of the work environment. You might have to search something because it's part of your job. Imagine you're a journalist, you have to search for something. Or what even is more on top, below this as well, is the cultural context, that your culture actually has an influence on your everyday perception of life. Yeah, so this is just to remind you, okay, information retrieval or the technical part is not just one thing. It actually is part of a wider kind of ecosystem. It has to be put into context. But here comes now the tricky part, and the tricky part is personalization. So personalization, what personalizes search engines and pretty much all kind of leading search engines, well, leading as we see, 90% is Google anyway, is that search engines tailor content presentation based on our interests. So they either re-rank the results or they filter the content to highlight the content that the search engines believe is interesting to us. And they do this by capturing user behavior and context. They're looking at users' location, devices you use, previously used queries, and previously clicked results, which is also called implicit relevance feedback. You just get some feedback from you, like who of you is aware that your search results are personalized? Maybe I do a quick, maybe I do a quick. Okay, I cannot do a poll, unfortunately, but yeah, so if you just type in me. Okay, yeah, so quite a few of you are aware of this. Okay, that's good. All right, so the problem of this personalization is now something that is called filter bubbles. For this, I wanted to point you to this quote here, which is from Eli Pariser, who calls himself an internet activist. He wrote this book here, you see on the right-hand side, and he also has a TED Talk. I highly recommend you to watch this TED Talk. So it's called Beware Online Filter Bubbles. What he says that personalization moves us very quickly toward a world in which the internet is showing us what it thinks we want to see, but not necessarily what we need to see. Yeah, so we kind of, the search engines or the internet, as he called it here, points us to the things that it believes we want to see, and the other things we don't notice anymore. All right, so this was just overview of the search engine basics and also just a pointer towards the filter bubbles. Now I hand over to Jo.
Okay, thanks, Frank. I don't know if you can all hear, but my next door neighbour is a musician and he's just started practicing about 15 minutes ago. So that's the soundtrack that you may be picking up on my mic if you can hear that. Before I get started, I'm just going to share a couple of links as well that I'll just mention later on in the talk. Okay, so as I'm sure you're all aware, sort of coming along to a talk like, a winter school like this, there's been significant interest in the research literature in the computer and information sciences, but more broadly in the social sciences and humanities as well, on this issue of bias in computational systems of different descriptions, and that's something that we've seen really grow and expand over the last few years. But it's not a new phenomenon that people have only just recently recognised. A classic work in this field was published by Fieber and Nissenbaum back in 1996. And I think the framework that they present in this paper is quite an interesting one for thinking through some of the issues around search engine bias and thinking through them in a socio-technical way. So some of you will be familiar with this this paper anyway, but for those of you that are not, I'll just give a quick overview. Freeman and Nissenbaum identified 3 categories of bias in computer systems. The first of these was pre-existing biases. So these are sort of biases that are rooted in social institutions, social practices, socio-cultural attitudes, the kind of biases that we might be thinking about if we're thinking about issues of systematic racism, systematic sexism, and things like that. So really deep-rooted issues. They also identified a second category of technical biases, and for the computer scientists in the room, it's possible that you're sort of more familiar with the literature in this area. And these are the kind of biases that are caused by technical constraints in systems and technical considerations. So if you know the conference Acm Fact, you'll have come across papers that tend to focus on this more technical category of bias in computer systems. And then the third category was emergent biases, and these are the kind of biases that arise when a system enters into a particular context of use. So context of use could be a shift between different countries or in particular sectors or particular types of organisations. So if you have a system that's working away in one sector and then you try and transplant that into a different sector or organisation, you may see emergent biases arising. So I think this is a nice sort of socio-technical framing to work with as we move through the next few examples. And I think something important to remember is all these things are interrelated as well. It's not that just something fits in pre-existing and not in technical and emergent, but they all sort of work together and shape one another. Okay, so just change the slide. Here we go. Give you a clue there. Okay, so one very clear way that we see and can observe biases emerging in the outputs of computational systems is in the search results that we're presented with every day. You know, the little survey that Frank did earlier suggested people are doing sort of at least sort of 10 to 50 searches a day, and we see all sorts of biases in these results. So just as a quick starter then, this is the search results for a query for the term person, done back in 2019, but I'm just going to give you a few seconds just to mention anything that you notice about this top page of search results returned for that query. Some famous people, yep. Yeah, male, white, yeah, male again. Too much Trump, there's definitely too much Trump. Yeah, so I think yeah, you've all picked up on this idea that what we were getting in the search results that were undertaken at this time was this really strong bias towards images of white male presenting people. There's also more emphasis on famous actors, famous people as well, a few stock images. If we just go through in a little bit more detail, And if we remove all of the images of male presenting people, this is what we're left with, which when you really highlight it like this, indicates there's some quite significant issues here in the imagery that's returned for this search query of person. First of all, I'd say, there's only most of the images are of children or teenagers, at least young people. There's only 2 obviously adult women there, which is really quite different from the images of the male presenting people. Also, what we see is that there's the 3 of the images are the same person, same model or stock image, whatever it is, and predominantly white, although it's a bit hard to fully say in some cases. If we move on to remove all the white people, then this is what we're left with. So bearing in mind that I did this search in the UK, not only do we see very few images of people of colour, what we do notice is that 4 of those people are North Americans. Only 1 is non-North American, and that's Malala, who's Pakistani. So there's an interesting bias there going on, not just with the numbers of people of colour in comparison to white people, but the types of people of colour that are represented in those results as well. And all famous or at least well-known people, they're there because of their what they've done in society and so on, rather than the sort of more generic stock images that you get of some demographics. And then this is the what we get if we remove the images of female presenting people and people of colour. We're left with all these really quite homogeneous image of white men. It's interesting to note, I think, here the sort of the number of shirts, the number of ties, the number of suits. This isn't a diverse representation of white men by any means. I was going to say like quite a professional sort of feel to it, but then as Jana pointed out, there's 3 pictures of Trump, so I'm not sure we can make that generalization. But yeah, what we're getting here is a very sort of particular sort of look in terms of white men. So when we think and dig down a little bit deeper into what we get back for this search query person, it really becomes quite problematic. And this issue of sociocultural biases, discrimination, stereotypes, and so on in search results of the major search engines is something that's been picked up a lot in the media and on social media over the last few years. So some of you may remember this clip that went viral back in 2016, and Frank's just added the Twitter, so you can play this video if you want. I can't do that in this platform, unfortunately. But what you get in this, this has changed slightly. Okay, so this is the what happened. If you play the video, you'll see the see what happens here. But essentially, what happened is that a user of Google search noticed that if he did a search for 3 black teenagers, what he got back was a series of different mugshots of groups of 3 black teenagers that had appeared in various news articles and so on. Whilst when he changed the term black for white, he was instead presented with these very wholesome, preppy stock images of white teenagers just about to go out for a game of soccer or basketball or something. So a real discrepancy there in terms of the kind of imagery that was reflected back just for that one change in search term between black and white. And these issues of racism in search results have received a lot of attention amongst researchers. So Safia Nobel is one of the key people that's been doing work in this field. So she has a background in library and information studies. A lot of her work is really quite qualitative, and I think that's what makes it particularly interesting and rich. And something that might be of interest for those of you more in the sort of quantitative computational space to explore in more depth. And she has done quite a lot of work around the kind of results that you get back for different search terms. So on the top left hand side here, you see the results returned for a search that she did on the term black girls. This was back in 2014. And the reason that she was doing this search actually was a very sort of ordinary everyday activity of looking for activities to do with her young niece. And instead of being returned some sort of nice activities to engage in with her family member, instead she was returned all these images of very highly sexualized images of young black girls. And this is certainly not an issue that we only see with search results for black girls. The LGBT community has often noted that if you do a search for lesbian, for example, you're more likely to be returned pornographic images than you are to be returned anything that you might sort of ordinarily be looking for. So there's sort of similar issues to do with the racism and gender-related issues, sexism-related issues that have been sort of reflected in the earlier example that I discussed in the image search results. But another thing that she was looking at as well was the search suggestions. So you can see here there's two examples here of search suggestions that she is talking about here. So there's the "Why are black people so?" and then the Google auto suggests the next term based on types of searches that are done by Google users. And then the one on the front cover of the book is "Why are black women so?" And then there's a range of words suggested. So what we see here is the Google auto suggest picking up these issues. So picking up these stereotypes, biases, racist attitudes, and so on of its user base. Now, Google has done a lot of work in this area, so these searches were done back in 2013. So it's important to bear that in mind. But you can see here that there was all sorts of issues to do with really problematic search suggestions going to users. So as I said, Safia Nobel's work is really quite qualitative in nature. There is a lot of quantitative work and computational work in this field as well, which is probably maybe what you're a bit more familiar with. This is just one example that I'm going to illustrate here, which was led by Jana, who is the lead on the SciCat project. And I collaborated on this, bringing a sort of social science perspective and another colleague from Sheffield. And what we were looking at is going back to that, looking at the images retrieved for the search term person. And what we did is to look at the top 100, 200, 500, and 1,000 results in 4 different search markets, so UK, US, India, and South Africa. And what we saw repeatedly was a very a much higher percentage of photos of people presenting as male that were returned in those search results. So you see for the top 100 results, we're looking at a sort of difference of 61-62% for people presenting male compared to sort of 10 to 12% people presenting as female. So a real significant difference. That although it does drop a little bit as you move into the top 1,000 results, it certainly doesn't change significantly. We also dug a little bit deeper and we're interested in looking at personality traits and how these were represented in image search results. So what we did here is to do searches for a range of personality traits with the term person. So for example, warm person, ambitious person, conscientious person, and so on, and then see what the gender makeup was of those search results. And what we found quite clearly was that the warm and communal type personality traits, such as warm person, sensitive person, emotional person, tended to retrieve more images of female presenting people, whereas the more agency orientated and the more competency orientated traits, such as intelligent person, rational person, conscientious person, and so on, tended to retrieve more images of male presenting people. So these results demonstrated for us that subtle gender biases are being reproduced in image search results. And there's various reasons why this happens, but the outcome is potentially that the search results are contributing to how societies reproduce gendered norms and expectations. So that was the work that we did there with Jana was very quantitative and computational in nature. But I think it's interesting to explore a little bit qualitatively what we saw going on with some of those search results as well. So this is just one example. If we take and I've switched to Google here because it was just a bit easier for me to be using. But if we do the search result for ambitious person, and I added on face there as well, just to narrow down the type of images that we were getting back, we can obviously count the sort of gender presentation of the people in the images, but if you just take a second to look at those images in a little bit more detail, a bit more qualitatively, I was wondering if there's anything else that you notice about these images that you might want to add to the text box. Okay, so yeah, we've got one comment there on the sort of qualitatively looking at these images. To sort of pointed out that there's a picture of a woman crying. So yeah, I think we'll dig into that a little bit more in a second. Just to respond to Shabnam's point. So it was we weren't measuring anybody's personality. What we did is a search for example, ambitious person, and a search for conscientious person, a search for determined person. And for each of those searches, we looked at we analysed the results that we got back. Yeah, the silly expressions on women's faces, Jana. Okay, yeah, so let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So if we remove all the images of the male presenting people, I'm not sure how clearly you can read those quotations, but what we're seeing there is 3 of these sort of quote photo things where the quotes are all really quite negative about ambition. So it's a well-known woman saying how they're not ambitious. They've never been an ambitious person. My participation in this industry is a fluke, is one thing. The ambitious person, in spite of his successes, always remains dissatisfied, and sort of comments, quotes like that. So if we just ignore those quote images for a while, and I think let's also ignore the two images on the left-hand side of Anne Frank and so on, because we're a little bit unsure why those images appeared. Frank thinks he's got a theory as to why Anne Frank is there, because clearly it's quite an unusual image to return for this search, but we don't really want to get into that just now. So let's just keep focused on the more sort of stock images on the right-hand side. And what we see here is coming through these really interesting stereotyped imagery of ambition in women. So often sort of social science and psychology literature will link to sort of this stereotype of ambitious women being conflicted in some way, psychologically conflicted. So you see this quite strongly represented in the image on the top row with a sort of smile and then the anger thing going on. And then in the bottom row we've got the you know, the woman with the fists lifted, so quite an aggressive type image. Again, a really obvious, strong stereotype of ambitious women is that they're aggressive in some sort of way. And then some other quite strange images. The only one that seems somewhat normal, I don't know who this person is, I don't know if anybody else does, or if she's just a random person that's appeared in these results, is the one in the middle on the bottom row. So quite an interesting take on female ambition there, I think, in those search results. On the other hand, if we look at the guys, what we see, again, you probably can't read those quotes, but they're all very positive about the nature of ambition and how, you know, success for the people that are being quoted. There's a bunch of different people there, some well-known people, some that I certainly don't know, but others may do. But what we see, sort of generally speaking, is an image of a confident, successful, happy, contented, ambitious, male-presenting person, with none of this real conflict or aggressiveness that we get with the female presenting images. The only one that's slightly unusual, I guess, is this one in the middle. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. So coming back to Friedman and Nissenbaum's three categories of bias in computer systems, if we just think a little bit through this lens, what we can say is that clearly we're seeing all sorts of pre-existing biases come through in these search results. It's clear evidence of the search results reflecting, and in some cases exaggerating, I'd say, existing systematic inequalities, particularly pre-existing discriminatory media representation in both news media representation and stock imagery and things like that. Criminal justice system biases as well, and how that plays out in the media is obviously coming through clearly in that three black teens case. And the results strongly reflect the social inequalities that we see in the US. So a lot of the imagery that we get, even if we're in the UK, is US imagery, but these reflect other Western countries as well, such as the UK. And all sorts of widespread biases and stereotypes. Now, there's vast social science literatures on all of these things to do with these pre-existing biases. I think sometimes there's a bit of a tendency within the information science field to draw on the psychology literature, which has its advantages in some cases, but there's a much wider literature as well, and I'd really recommend you digging into some of the sociology and media studies literature on some of these issues if you really want to get a deep understanding of the socio-cultural context that's sort of feeding into these kind of issues. And then there's the technical aspects of bias as well. So obviously, there's the things such as selection of data sources, the ranking algorithms, any bias detection mechanisms that they may or may not be using. And then there's the emergent aspect as well. And I think we see something really quite interesting here when media imagery from news media and stock imagery and so on become search results. It really shines a spotlight on some of the really problematic issues in that media imagery that we are all sort of that's circulating all around us in different ways. And also I think there's this issue that I mentioned earlier of another emergent bias we see coming through quite strongly is US dominated images for a searcher in the UK. So, in the UK we have quite different demographics to the USA. So when we're thinking about issues of socio-cultural bias and so on, we might be thinking about it in a slightly different way. We might correct in a slightly different way or want to see different things in our search results. Yet the UK is not so different to the US when we look relative to the sort of wider world. And it's a bit unclear to me how much this US dominated imagery is the same thing across different countries with very, very different demographics in different places. So I think that's something interesting to explore. Okay, so that's it for me, and I'm going to hand over to Frank now. Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Jo. All right, so now going to get a little bit down to the technical side as well to look into, okay, why do we have this bias, or where is this bias coming from? For this, I wanted to point you to this article here, which is written by Ricardo Baeza-Yates. Just going to post the link in the chat window as well. So you more than welcome to read it. It's open access. You can read it without any, it's not behind a paywall. So Ricardo has been working on kind of biased web in a web context for a long time. And he provides a very nice overview of different types of bias. And so this screenshot here, this figure is from his paper, and I just copy and paste it from there. Just going to talk to you briefly about the different types of bias that he's talking about, and then afterwards we're going to look at an example together. So let's start with the bias that you see on the right-hand side, which is called the activity bias, this one here. So what he means by this is that the data that we find on the internet, when we're talking about web search engines, is created by a relatively small number of people. So you have very few very active people and a lot of people who don't produce any content. So if you think about, let's take Wikipedia as an example, you have a lot of people who access Wikipedia, but they're only reading it. And then you have a very small number of people who actually contribute to Wikipedia. And the same can be said about the web on its own. Yeah? So you have this, what you call the activity bias, small number of people producing content, which will then be indexed by web search engines, as opposed to, well, the larger number of people who actually don't produce any content. Then he talks about data bias. So think about this small group of people. They have a specific worldview, and they express this worldview in the data, in the websites that they produce. We have already, first of all, because of this activity bias, small number of people working on this, producing this content, and then they have a specific point of view, and that's what they put into the data. Yeah? So that's the second bias that he's talking about. Then he mentions here sampling bias. What he means by that is that, well, web search engines, they actually don't access the whole web. They have only access to a small subset of the web. So that means you're already filtering down the search results that are available, that a search engine or an algorithm, as he calls it here on this visualization, can actually interact with or can process. All right, so we have these three types of biases. Now you can also have the algorithmic bias, which is what the search engine does to present search results. So for example, think about a search engine that maybe ranks those documents lower that has a lot of spelling mistakes. Yeah, so that means it has a bias included in there that it reduces these kind of viewpoints that might be written by people who are not very good at spelling. That's just a very basic and maybe silly example, but just to show you how this algorithmic bias can come about here. Then we have here our users who interact with the results on the screen, and they have a specific interaction bias. Interaction bias means, for example, where on the website, on a search, where on this engine, where are the visualized. You click maybe much more, interact much more with the top 10 results, and you ignore more the results on the second or third page. Now, that's the kind of interaction bias. He also talks about this self-selection bias, which means that you might only be actually interacting with this content that you find more interesting or that kind of supports your worldview. Then he also talks about second order bias. So what he means by this is that, let's say if you have a personalization system that relies on, well, creates a user profile based on what you click on, so what you interact and what kind of documents you select, this creates already a bias for the algorithm. Yeah, so let's say if your user profile that has been created based on interaction influences the algorithm, this already has an impact on, will create more algorithmic bias. Also, content providers will notice, okay, you are very interested in this kind of, a lot of people are interested in this kind of document. Let's produce more similar content. That's why this second order bias has an impact on the data itself. All right, let's look at this. Let's take an example here. Let's say we have a news search engine like Google News. And okay, I just searched here for COVID-19. I got a few search results. And I want you to think a bit about this now. What type of bias, or how can this bias influence the search results that you would get from a news search engine like Google News, for example? Yeah, we're not right now saying Google News has these issues. In fact, Google has been, as Joe pointed out before, they have been working on this already to improve the situation. But let's say if you just take a dummy news search engine that is not really, like, doesn't care too much about avoiding bias, how would these different types of bias be, like what effect would that have? Does anyone want to give a start? Just, you can write an answer, comment in the chat window. Okay, so Berta says activity bias. Yeah, can you say a little bit more how you think this could be impacting? Others are also more than welcome to chip in as well. Okay, yeah, so the producers of information. So in the context of COVID-19, you might observe that you have maybe, for example, a lot of news publishers from the US talking about COVID-19. In fact, well, unfortunately, this is kind of hiding the search results now, but you see FDA.gov, New York.gov. So the search results, they seem to be very America-centric already, although I created a screenshot. This also talks about LA County. I created a screenshot and I'm logged in while I'm in the UK. Yeah, so actually you already see kind of this focus on America on this screenshot here. Okay, any other biases that you can think of? So I mentioned that I'm logged in here, yeah? So just mind these are already personalized search results. Now imagine, do you remember the filter bubble I mentioned earlier? And you might observe this a lot in the kind of in America these days, that you have these really kind of filter bubble effects that you can observe, polarization that we see, that let's say if you are interested in specific topic, you kind of completely ignore one side of the argument. Yeah, so you might, if you think about COVID-19, if you are kind of if you believe, okay, face masks might actually be a good thing to stop this, then maybe you create a user profile by clicking more, you read more articles from from CNN, for example. So you might get into one specific direction. This kind of the self-selection bias. This has an impact on the, it will have an algorithmic bias if you have personalized search results. And then you might get kind of the negative kind of critics of COVID-19 results get filtered out. On the other hand, of course, if you easily fall for conspiracy theories, you might be kind of sucked into the world of more conspiracies just based on the self-selection bias. Yeah, so that also mentioned the interaction bias, yeah, which is maybe similar here, yeah. So I might click on the first 5 results, whatever comes afterwards I might ignore. Yeah, that's the bias that we could have in there. And sampling bias, I think to talk about this as well, very clear as well. It might be that the search engine does not cover websites or sources that I might be interested in. At the same time, data bias might be here. In this case, America being an American search engine seems to be very strongly focused on American sources here. All right, so just to point you to a few papers that I found relevant or interesting to read. This one here is written by Michael Beam from 2014. So he studied the impact of personalized news systems on users. And what he found was that users more often choose news stories that align with their own preferences. And then, of course, personalized news systems actually had a very negative direct effect on knowledge gain because of the filter bubble. Yeah, so these search personalized news systems just gave you more of the same, which kind of filtered out all the content that you might not be interested in or that you might not have interacted with before. Another paper from 2017. So Dominic Spohr, he talks about filter bubble and polarization. So he noticed that ideological polarization and information consumption are strongly intertwined. And one of the conclusions is that personalization systems make things worse, which is probably something we're observing these days in particular. This one here was an interesting article. This is not academic one. It's appeared in the New York Times, The Making of a YouTube Radical. So this is about this gentleman here, Caleb Gein, who was a college dropout, and he was kind of spending a lot of time on YouTube, which probably a lot of us have done during the lockdown as well, during the pandemic. So what happened was that this person, he was, it's a quote from the article, soon he was pulled into a far-right universe, watching thousands of videos filled with conspiracy theories, misogyny, and racism. So it's a nice example of showing how actually search engines, and just a video search engine, had an impact on a person's kind of viewpoint and turned that person into a radical. Okay, so but how do we deal with this bias? Well, we have, sorry, 1 second. Luckily, it's identified as a problem already. Just going to point to this paper, this article here from Keith Kirkpatrick, published in Communications of the ACM, where they clearly say that there's a problem that algorithms that are defined by humans using data provided by humans actually will produce some bias. Yeah, so it's identified as a problem. This is, so ACM, of course, is kind of a computing-oriented journal or association. But also in a society that is identified. So this one here is a quote from Margaret Vestager. She's the executive president of the European Commission for a Europe Fit for the Digital Age. This is from December 2020. She gave a talk where she said that the proposals that we're working on, there's a legislative proposal she's talking about, would mean platforms have to tell users how their recommender systems decide which content to show. So it's easier for us to judge whether to trust the picture of the world that they give us or not. Yeah, so the legislators are aware of this problem. They're working on it to put it into set up a legal legislation that require the companies, content providers, to provide clarity, transparency in the search results or recommendation results. I mentioned earlier already the ACM. So the ACM is also kind of leading uptake on approaching the like fairness, accountability, and transparency. So an example is the Acm Fact Conference, which is an annual conference, which I think is now in its fourth year. Yeah, so since 2018, which is focusing specifically on FATE, so fairness, accountability, and transparency and ethics. At the same time, we see content providers. Here's one example from the BBC, who is trying to deal with this kind of filter bubble. So the BBC, in 2000, this is a screenshot from 2019. The BBC is working on an algorithm that, as it says in the article, they want to pop your bubble. So they want to avoid filter bubble. They want to diversify the recommendations that you get on their platforms. Similarly, we have, of course, search engines like Google is working on the problems. So here's a screenshot from, if you search Google, go to Google Image and you search for person. This is from this year. So this is the results you get. So do you notice anything if you look at the results here? Yeah, so it's more diversity in there. Yeah, so it seems like they have learned from their mistake, maybe. Yeah, okay, more diverse. So maybe I have to be a bit quick because I'm running out of time. So it's interesting. Yes, maybe a bit more diverse and they're mostly non-famous. That's maybe true as well. You still have, however, still predominantly white faces, right? And where actually the women of color, they are not represented in here as well. And one interesting thing is here, okay, so Google has tried to kind of have a gender balance in there and reflect different ethnicities, but it's kind of reflecting in it's a very American-centric viewpoint. Yeah, so if you think about, okay, let's say persons in UK, you would expect far more Indian or Pakistani faces, which are not really represented in here, right? So this is again kind of a racial makeup maybe of the US, which is not always accurate for other countries. Yeah, you still have this kind of bias in there, even though they try to de-bias something. Yes, that's true. Greta Thunberg appears in there a lot. All right, of course, so although Google is trying their best, maybe, well, trying something to improve the situation, they still have issues. So this one was a big case a couple of weeks ago that they just fired they had hired before Timnit Gebru was one of the leading AI ethics researchers, and they have fired her. So, which was because she wanted to publish a paper about risks of larger language models, which of course has an impact on search engines. And he identified several risks in there, and Google didn't want to see the paper published. Yeah, so there's still issues in there. Right? It's not that everything is sunshine. Right, so Nisa said, don't see people with physical differences, people in wheelchairs or using walkers. That's a good point as well. If you think about, if you really want to diversify, like how to what extent do you go and diversify something, and also when is it appropriate to diversify something. Yeah, so if you think about, let's say, the riots that happened in the US, in the Capitol, if you search for faces there, well, do you need to diversify it, or you just show as it was white faces? Yeah, so it's very difficult sometimes to really see when you need to diversify something. All right, so that was the last part. Now I just have two more slides. One is I wanted to give you a viewing tip. This is you can find this on YouTube. It's the Acm Rex's keynote from last year by Ricardo Belzer-Yates. He talks about bias on search and recommender systems. Yeah, so he gives a very good overview of the different types of bias that I just mentioned earlier as well. So if you find the time, please have a look at this video. It's very well, very interesting. And Joe?
Yeah, and I just wanted to finish off by giving you a couple of pointers on places to look if you're interested in exploring the sort of more critical social science humanities perspectives a little bit more. So literatures and communities beyond the sort of information science and computer science spaces. I definitely recommend by having a read of Sophia Noble's work. Algorithms of Oppression is very accessible, and there's other stuff that she's done as well. She's also one of the key people behind this new UCLA Centre for Critical Internet Inquiry, which has got a lot of big names in the US sort of tech society scene that are doing work on a variety of projects. But I imagine, given Sophia Noble's presence in this, that there will be some potentially some more work in this kind of area connected to that. And just some more general plugs, not necessarily search related, but sort of bias, transparency, critical tech related. So to move out of the UK possibly a little bit, there's the Data Justice Lab in the UK that are doing some really excellent work. There's journals such as Big Data and Society, the Data Power Conference, where all these issues are discussed by social scientists and people in the humanities, and of course the Data and Society Institute in the USA as well. So yeah, thank you for listening, and hope you've taken something useful from it. Thank you.